My name is Amara, I'm 32 years old, and my husband married his dream woman right in front of me, after threatening me with divorce papers. But the moment I saw her face, I knew everything. What he didn't know was that this wedding would destroy both of them. If you enjoy dark stories of betrayal, karma, and revenge, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. I read every single one. Let me start from the beginning, because the pain I'm about to share with you didn't happen overnight. It was built brick by brick, lie by lie, over 7 years of marriage to a man I thought I knew. Marcus was everything I thought I wanted when I was 25. Charming in that dangerous way that makes you ignore red flags. Successful in his real estate business, always closing deals, always making connections. He had this smile that could convince anyone of anything, including me, especially me. But charm fades when you live with someone day after day. What remains is who they really are when no one's watching. And Marcus? Marcus was cold, calculating. He saw relationships as transactions, and I was slowly realizing I'd been on the losing end of our deal for years. I gave him everything. I supported his business when it was struggling in those early years, working double shifts as a nurse to keep us afloat while he chased his dreams. I moved away from my family when he got that big opportunity in another state. I put my own career aspirations on hold, again and again, because his success was supposed to be our success. But success has a way of changing people. Or maybe it just reveals who they always were underneath. The emotional distance started small. Fewer conversations at dinner. Less interest in my day. When I tried to talk about having children, he'd change the subject. When I suggested we take a vacation together, he was always too busy. I became a ghost in my own marriage, existing around the edges of his increasingly important life. I told myself it was temporary, that he was just focused on building our future, that things would get better once he achieved whatever milestone he was chasing. But there's always another milestone, isn't there? Another goal, another deal, another reason why now wasn't the right time for us. The loneliness was suffocating. I'd lie awake at night next to this man I'd promised to love forever, feeling more alone than I ever had when I was actually single. At least then, the emptiness made sense. But I stayed, because I believed in marriage, because I thought love meant enduring the hard times, because leaving felt like admitting failure, because he made me believe that my expectations were too high, that I was asking for too much. Then came the threats. It was a Tuesday morning in March when everything changed. I was getting ready for work, trying to pretend everything was normal, when Marcus cornered me in our bedroom. He had these papers in his hand, and this look on his face that I'd never seen before. Cold. Final. "I've been thinking about us, Amara," he said, his voice eerily calm. "About whether this marriage is really working." My heart stopped. 7 years of walking on eggshells, and this was how it would end? With him holding divorce papers like a weapon? "What are you talking about?" I whispered, though deep down I already knew. "I think we both know this isn't what either of us wanted it to be," he continued, setting the papers on our dresser like they were just another piece of mail. "I've had these drawn up. Just in case. Just in case." Like our marriage was a business deal that might not work out. The pain was immediate and total. 7 years of my life, and he was treating our ending like a casual conversation about changing insurance providers. But what came next was worse than the threat itself. "But," he said, and I grabbed onto that word like a lifeline, "I think there might be a way to work through this. To find some closure." Closure. He was already talking about us in past tense. "I want you to come to something with me this weekend. A wedding. I think it'll help you understand some things about what I need. About what real love looks like." I should have said no. Should have grabbed those papers and signed them right there. Should have walked out with whatever dignity I had left. But when you've been drowning in a marriage for years, even a cruel lifeline feels like hope. "Whose wedding?" I managed to ask. His smile was different then. Satisfied. Like he'd won something I didn't even know we were competing for. "A friend of mine. Someone very special. I think once you see what we have, you'll understand why our marriage feels so empty." Our marriage feels empty. Not his feelings, not his dissatisfaction. Our marriage. Like I was equally responsible for his emotional detachment. like I hadn't spent years trying to bridge the gap he kept widening between us. I agreed to go, because I was still hoping there was some path back to each other. Because I couldn't imagine my life without him, even though my life with him had become unbearable. Because I was terrified and desperate and still believing that love could fix anything. If you're watching this and you've ever been in a relationship where you've lost yourself completely, please hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're from. Your support means everything to me as I share this story. Saturday came too quickly and not quickly enough. I spent hours getting ready, trying to look beautiful for a man who was taking me to watch him celebrate someone else's happiness. I chose a navy dress that he used to say looked good on me, back when he noticed things like that. I did my makeup carefully, hoping foolishly that maybe he'd see me the way he used to. The venue was beautiful. One of those historic mansions with perfect gardens and enough elegance to make any bride feel like royalty. Marcus was different there, more animated than I'd seen him in months. He knew people, worked the crowd, introduced me as his wife with the kind of pride I hadn't felt from him in years. For a moment, I let myself hope. Maybe this was his way of showing me something important. Maybe seeing other people in love would remind him of what we could have together. But then he led me to our seats, front row, and I realized this wasn't about reconciliation at all. This was about humiliation. Perfect view, he said, settling in beside me like we were at a movie theater. I want you to see everything. The guests around us were whispering. I caught fragments of their conversations, enough to understand that everyone knew something I didn't. They looked at me with a mixture of pity and curiosity, like I was a fascinating tragedy unfolding in real time. Poor thing, I heard someone murmur behind me. Can't believe he brought her, came another voice. So cruel, whispered a third. I wanted to disappear. To dissolve into the ground and never face whatever was coming. But I sat there, frozen, as the music started and the ceremony began. The groom came out first, and my breath caught in my throat. He was nervous, excited, radiating the kind of joy that Marcus had never shown at our own wedding. This man was marrying the love of his life, and everyone could see it. Then came the bridesmaids, a parade of women in soft pink dresses, smiling and elegant. I found myself looking for clues, trying to figure out who this bride was that Marcus was so eager for me to see. Someone from his work? An ex-girlfriend? Someone he'd been having an affair with? The music changed, and everyone stood. This was it. The moment Marcus had brought me here to witness. The moment that would supposedly help me understand why our marriage was empty. I turned toward the back of the venue, my heart hammering in my chest, prepared to see some stunning woman who would make me feel inadequate and replaceable. Prepared for the final blow to whatever was left of my self-worth. But when the bride appeared at the end of the aisle, my world tilted off its axis. It was Sarah. My half-sister Sarah. The bride was my half-sister, walking down the aisle in a dress that cost more than my yearly salary, glowing with happiness as she moved toward the man who was clearly the love of her life. And Marcus, sitting beside me, was watching my face with sick satisfaction. My hands started shaking. Actually shaking, like I was freezing cold in the middle of a sunny spring day. There was a ringing in my ears, and for a moment I thought I might pass out right there in front of everyone. Sarah, my father's daughter from his second marriage, the perfect child who got everything I didn't. The beauty, the charm, the college education that my family couldn't afford for me. The one who got Dad's attention, Dad's pride, Dad's love in a way I never did. We'd been close once, when we were young. Before I understood what it meant to always come second. Before I realized that in every room we entered together, I became invisible. Before she started dating every boy I'd ever had a crush on, not because she wanted them, but because she could. I hadn't seen her in over 3 years. Not since the last family gathering where she'd made some casual comment about how some people just aren't meant for success while looking directly at me. Not since she'd suggested that maybe I was settling for Marcus because I couldn't do better. And now here she was, marrying a man who clearly worshipped the ground she walked on, while my own husband sat beside me savoring my pain. But it was more than just seeing Sarah in a wedding dress that broke something inside me. It was the way Marcus was watching me watch her. Like this whole thing was entertainment for him. Like my devastation was the point. Beautiful, isn't she? He whispered in my ear as Sarah glided down the aisle. That's what real happiness looks like. The pieces started falling into place with horrible clarity. This wasn't random. Marcus bringing me here, making sure I had a front row seat to Sarah's perfect day, wasn't coincidence. This was calculated, planned, designed to destroy me. How long had he known her? How long had he been comparing me to her? How many times had he sat across from me at dinner, looking bored and distant, thinking about Sarah's laugh or Sarah's success or Sarah's effortless way of commanding attention? I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. I wanted to stand up in that beautiful venue and expose whatever sick game Marcus was playing. But I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. Could barely process what was happening. Sarah reached the altar, and when she turned to face her groom, I saw her profile clearly for the first time. She was radiant in that way that some women just are, like happiness was literally glowing from inside her. And for one awful moment, I understood why Marcus had brought me here to see it. This was what he wanted me to know I wasn't. Could never be. Would never be. The ceremony continued around me like a blur. Words about love and commitment and choosing each other every day. Promises that sounded like everything I'd wanted Marcus to feel about me. Everything I'd begged for in our marriage without ever saying the words out loud. I caught fragments of the vows, heard Sarah's future husband promise to love her with his whole heart, to support her dreams, to choose her above all others for the rest of his life. Basic wedding promises that somehow felt revolutionary because they were being said with such obvious sincerity. This man, whoever he was, meant every word he was saying. You could see it in his face, hear it in his voice. He wasn't just going through the motions or saying what people expected to hear. He was making promises he intended to keep to a woman he couldn't imagine living without. And Marcus had brought me here to show me the difference. When they kissed, the crowd erupted in applause and cheers. I clapped too, mechanically, because not clapping would have drawn attention I couldn't handle. But inside, something fundamental was changing. The grief was still there, the humiliation, the betrayal. But underneath it all, something else was building. Rage. Pure, clean, focused rage. At the reception, Marcus was in his element. Charming everyone, telling stories, playing the role of devoted husband while simultaneously showing me off like evidence of his own settling. He introduced me to people as his wife, but there was something in his tone that made it clear he thought he could have done better. People kept asking how we knew the bride and groom. Marcus would smile and say something vague about business connections, but I could see him watching Sarah across the room. Studying her. Comparing her to me and finding me lacking. That's when I started to piece together the timeline. Sarah had been living in our city for over a year. I'd heard about it through family, though we hadn't spoken directly. She'd gotten some high-powered job in marketing, bought a beautiful apartment, started dating seriously. My stepmother had mentioned it during one of our awkward phone calls, probably not realizing she was twisting the knife by talking about Sarah's success. Marcus's business had started taking off around the same time. He'd been traveling more, working longer hours, making new connections in the marketing world. Connections that apparently included my half-sister. Had he sought her out? Had he known who she was when they met? Had he been planning this humiliation for months? The thought made me physically sick, but it also crystallized my rage into something harder and more focused. If this was a game, if my pain was entertainment, then maybe it was time to change the rules. I started paying attention differently. Watching Marcus work the room, noting who he talked to and how they responded. Listening to conversations, filing away information. Learning things. For anyone who's ever felt completely powerless in their own life, please subscribe and let me know in the comments what country you're from. Sometimes we need to know we're not alone in feeling lost. That's when I overheard the conversation that changed everything. I was standing near the bar, pretending to enjoy a glass of wine I couldn't taste, when two women started talking behind me. They were discussing Sarah's relationship, her whirlwind romance, how lucky she was to find someone so perfect for her. Though I have to say, one of them said, "It's interesting how she ended up with David after that whole thing with her sister's husband." My blood turned to ice. "What do you mean?" the other woman asked. Oh, you didn't hear about the drama? Apparently, Sarah's half-sister is married to this real estate guy who's been pursuing Sarah for months. Sending flowers, showing up at her work, making all kinds of inappropriate advances. Sarah finally had to threaten him with harassment charges to get him to stop. That's awful. What kind of man does that? The kind who thinks he can have whatever he wants, I guess. Sarah said he kept telling her that he was trapped in a loveless marriage, that his wife didn't understand him. Classic cheater behavior. But Sarah's too smart for that nonsense. Good for her. And now she's marrying someone who actually deserves her. They moved away, leaving me standing there with the pieces of my shattered world rearranging themselves into an even more horrifying picture. Marcus hadn't brought me here to show me what love looked like. He'd brought me here to punish me for existing while he couldn't have Sarah. He'd brought me here because Sarah had rejected him, and he wanted me to witness her happiness while being reminded of my own inadequacy. But more than that, he'd spent months pursuing my sister. Months lying to me about where he was going and who he was seeing. Months using our marriage as a sob story to try to manipulate another woman into bed. The humiliation was complete now, but so was my clarity. I walked back to our table, where Marcus was sitting alone, watching Sarah dance with her new husband. His expression was hungry and resentful, like a child watching other kids play with a toy he couldn't have. "She's beautiful," I said, sitting down beside him. He turned to me with surprise, probably expecting tears or accusations. Instead, I was smiling. Calm. Almost serene. "She really is," he agreed, testing the waters. "You must know her pretty well, to get invited to such an intimate ceremony." His eyes narrowed slightly. He was trying to figure out my angle, why I wasn't falling apart the way he'd planned. "We've done some business together," he said carefully. "I'm sure you have." I let that sit between us for a moment, watching his face as he tried to interpret my tone. "I think it's time for us to go," I said finally. "I've seen enough." On the drive home, Marcus kept glancing at me like I was a bomb that might go off at any moment. He'd orchestrated this whole elaborate cruelty, and I wasn't reacting the way he'd expected. I wasn't crying or screaming or begging for explanations. I was planning. Because here's what Marcus didn't know about Sarah. Here's what he'd never bothered to learn during his months of pathetic pursuit. Sarah might be beautiful and successful and charming, but she was also vindictive and petty and absolutely ruthless when crossed. And here's what he definitely didn't know. I had documentation of everything. See, when you're married to someone who's emotionally checked out, you start noticing things. You start paying attention to credit card statements and phone bills and travel receipts. Not because you're looking for evidence of cheating, but because you're trying to understand why your husband has become a stranger. I had months of evidence of Marcus's pursuit of Sarah. Hotel bills for nights he claimed to be working late. Restaurant charges for expensive dinners he never took me on. Flower deliveries that never showed up at our house. Phone records showing hundreds of calls and texts to a number I'd eventually identified as Sarah's. I had enough evidence to destroy his business reputation. To show every client and colleague exactly what kind of man they were dealing with. To expose him as the kind of predator who uses his marriage as a manipulation tactic. But more importantly, I had something else. Something Marcus had given me himself without realizing it. During our worst fights, when I'd asked him why he seemed so distant, he'd sometimes let things slip. Comments about how I wasn't ambitious enough, wasn't social enough, wasn't successful enough for someone like him. How he'd married me when he was younger and less established, but now that he was successful, he deserved better. He'd recorded these conversations. Not intentionally, but his phone had a habit of pocket dialing people, and I'd learned to save the voicemails when they included interesting information. I had recordings of my husband detailing exactly how much he regretted marrying me. How he considered me beneath him now. How he was actively pursuing other women because I wasn't good enough for his new status in life. Information that would be very interesting to certain people. Like his business partners, who prided themselves on family values. Like his biggest clients, who trusted him because he seemed like a devoted family man. Like Sarah's new husband, who probably didn't know his wife's wedding had been attended by her stalker. The next morning, Marcus left for work like nothing had happened. Like he hadn't just spent the weekend psychologically torturing me for his own amusement. He kissed my cheek, told me he'd be late again tonight, and walked out of our house with the same casual cruelty he'd shown for months. I waited until his car disappeared around the corner, then I got to work. If you're enjoying this story of karma coming full circle, please subscribe and tell me in the comments what state or country you're from. Knowing you're out there listening gives me the strength to finish telling this. The plan wasn't complicated, but it was thorough. I started with his business. Marcus's real estate company was built on relationships and reputation. His clients trusted him with their biggest financial decisions because he presented himself as trustworthy, stable, family-oriented. His partners had brought him into their firm because he seemed like the kind of man who shared their values. I sent anonymous emails to every client and business partner, including the voice recordings of Marcus describing his contempt for marriage and his active pursuit of other women. I included photos of credit card statements showing his spending on hotels and gifts for women who weren't his wife. I made sure they understood exactly what kind of man they were doing business with. But I didn't stop there. I contacted the state real estate board with evidence of Marcus using company resources and client relationships to pursue personal relationships, using his position of trust to access women's personal information, mixing business and his personal predatory behavior in ways that violated multiple ethical codes. Then I called Sarah's husband. That conversation was harder than I'd expected. David seemed like a genuinely good man, and I hated being the one to tell him that his wedding had been attended by someone who'd been stalking his wife for months. But he deserved to know. More importantly, Sarah deserved to face consequences for the years of cruelty she'd inflicted on me, and this felt like the perfect opportunity. I sent David everything. The evidence of Marcus's pursuit, the recordings of him talking about using his marriage as a sob story to manipulate women, the credit card records showing expensive gifts that had clearly been refused. I made sure he understood that his wife had been dealing with a married man's harassment for months and had never thought to mention it. Finally, I did the one thing I should have done months earlier. I called a lawyer. Not just any lawyer. Sarah's ex-boyfriend from college, who'd become one of the most successful divorce attorneys in the state. Someone who knew exactly how vindictive Sarah could be and would appreciate the irony of representing her half-sister in destroying a man Sarah had rejected. By the time Marcus came home that evening, his world was already crumbling, though he didn't know it yet. I was in the kitchen, cooking dinner like I had every night for 7 years. He walked in expecting his usual routine, expecting me to serve him food and attention while he scrolled through his phone and ignored my existence. Instead, I handed him a glass of wine and smiled. "How was your day?" I asked, genuinely curious to see how long it would take for the first consequences to hit. "Fine," he said, distracted. "Same as always." We ate dinner in our usual silence. Marcus checked his phone constantly, frowning occasionally, but not seeming too concerned. His business partners probably wouldn't start receiving the anonymous emails until the next day. The real estate board moved slowly. David would need time to process what he'd learned. The beautiful thing about revenge, I was learning, is that anticipation is almost as satisfying as the actual event. "I've been thinking about what you said," I told him as we finished eating. "About closure." He looked up, interested for the first time in months. "I think you're right. I think it's time for both of us to move on." His smile was triumphant and cruel. He thought he'd won. Thought his psychological torture had finally broken me down into accepting his narrative about our failed marriage. "I'm glad you're finally seeing things clearly," he said. "Oh, I am. More clearly than I ever have." That night, Marcus went to bed satisfied that he'd successfully destroyed my spirit. That he'd shown me my place and convinced me to accept the end of our marriage on his terms. He had no idea that by morning, his phone would be ringing off the hook with clients canceling contracts. That his partners would be scheduling emergency meetings to discuss his future with the company. That Sarah's husband would be demanding explanations that Sarah couldn't give. I lay awake next to him, listening to him sleep peacefully for what I knew would be the last time. Tomorrow, his carefully constructed world would start falling apart. But tonight, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. The first call came at 6:47 a.m. Marcus's phone rang with that urgent tone that meant business crisis. He answered it groggily, then sat up straight as whoever was calling started talking. I couldn't hear the words, but I could hear the tone. Angry. Disappointed. Final. What do you mean, canceling the contract? Marcus said, his voice sharp with panic. We're 3 days from closing. More angry voices from the phone. I don't understand, Marcus continued. What recordings? What evidence? I got up and started making coffee, humming softly to myself. It was going to be a beautiful day. By 8 a.m., Marcus had received 6 more calls. Clients pulling out of deals. Partners demanding meetings. The state real estate board requesting documentation for an ethics investigation. His face was gray with panic and confusion. He kept looking at his phone like it had betrayed him, like it was malfunctioning and delivering someone else's crisis by mistake. Amara, he said finally, his voice cracking with desperation. Something's happening. Someone's spreading lies about me. Trying to destroy my business. That's terrible, I said, pouring myself a second cup of coffee. Who would do something like that? I don't know, but I need to figure it out. I need to fix this. He was pacing now, running his hands through his hair, making frantic calls to try to contain the damage. But it was too late. Once trust is broken in business relationships, it's nearly impossible to rebuild. The real estate board moved faster than I'd expected. By noon, Marcus received notice that his license was under review pending a full investigation. His partners called an emergency meeting for the next day to discuss his immediate suspension from the firm. But the best was yet to come. At 2:15 p.m., David called. I watched Marcus's face cycle through confusion, recognition, and terror as David introduced himself and explained why he was calling. Watched him try to lie and deflect and minimize what he'd done. Watched him realize that David had evidence, documentation, proof of everything. I can explain, Marcus kept saying. It wasn't what it looked like. I never meant. But David wasn't interested in explanations. He was interested in making sure Marcus understood that any future contact with his wife would result in restraining orders and harassment charges. That everyone in Sarah's professional network would know exactly what kind of man Marcus was. When the call ended, Marcus sat in stunned silence for several minutes. Then he turned to me with eyes full of desperate calculation. Amara, I think someone's targeting our family. Trying to break us apart. We need to stick together, figure out who's doing this. Our family. After months of treating me like an unwanted roommate, suddenly we were a team again. You're probably right, I said. It's awful how people can be so vindictive. Relief flooded his face. He thought I was going to help him. Thought my loyalty could be counted on, the way it always had been. I knew you'd understand. We've always been stronger together. Absolutely. In fact, I think I might know who's behind this. Hope lit up his expression. Really? Who? Me. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched understanding dawn on his face like a slow-motion car crash. Watched him realize that his devoted, submissive wife had systematically destroyed everything he'd built. What? He whispered. I said it was me. I'm the one who sent the recordings to your clients. I'm the one who reported you to the real estate board. I'm the one who told David everything about your pathetic pursuit of his wife. His face went through several colors before settling on a pale shade of green. That's impossible, he said. You don't even know. David Morrison? Sarah's husband? The man whose wedding you dragged me to so you could torture me with your unrequited obsession? Oh, I know him very well now. We had a lovely conversation about his wife's stalker. Marcus stood up so fast he knocked over his chair. You're lying. Am I? Check your phone. I'm sure David sent you some very clear messages about what happens if you ever contact Sarah again. He grabbed his phone with shaking hands, scrolled through his messages, then looked at me like he was seeing a stranger. Why? He whispered. Why would you destroy me? The question was so breathtakingly narcissistic that I actually laughed. Destroy you? Marcus, I didn't destroy you. I just stopped protecting you from the consequences of your own choices. But I'm your husband. Yes, you are. And for 7 years, I've watched you become someone I don't recognize. Someone cruel and selfish and completely indifferent to my pain. So when you decided to use me as entertainment for your own twisted games, I decided it was time to stop being your victim. If this story is resonating with anyone who's ever felt invisible in their own relationship, please subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Your support means everything as I share this final chapter. Over the next week, Marcus's life continued to unravel with beautiful precision. His business partners voted unanimously to terminate his contract. The real estate board suspended his license pending a full investigation that would likely result in permanent revocation. Three major clients sued him for breach of contract, claiming his ethical violations had damaged their trust in the deals he'd brokered. But the social consequences were almost worse than the financial ones. Marcus had built his identity around being successful and respected. He'd surrounded himself with people who admired his achievements and envied his lifestyle. When word spread about why he'd really lost his business, those same people disappeared faster than his bank balance. Sarah, meanwhile, was dealing with her own crisis. David had apparently not taken the news well that his bride had been hiding months of harassment from a married man. Their honeymoon was cut short for what Sarah's family diplomatically called personal reasons. I heard through the family grapevine that David was questioning whether Sarah had encouraged Marcus's attention, whether she'd enjoyed having a married man pursuing her, whether she was the kind of person who thrived on drama and chaos. For someone like Sarah, who defined herself by being desired and envied, having her new husband doubt her integrity was devastating. Having her social circle whisper about her involvement with a married stalker was even worse. Marcus tried everything to salvage the situation. He begged, he threatened, he promised to change. He suggested couples therapy, a fresh start, a vacation to work on our marriage. When none of that worked, he tried to blame me for his choices, suggesting that his pursuit of Sarah was my fault for not being a good enough wife. That's when I showed him the divorce papers I'd had drawn up. Papers that detailed his infidelity, his emotional abuse, his misuse of marital assets to pursue other women. Papers that would ensure I got far more than half of everything we'd built together. "You can't do this to me," he said, his voice breaking. "I'll have nothing left." "You'll have exactly what you gave me," I replied. "The chance to start over." The house sold quickly. I took my settlement and moved across the country, far from Marcus and Sarah and all the wreckage of my old life. I bought a small cottage near the ocean and went back to school to become a nurse practitioner, something I'd always wanted to do but never had the chance. Marcus declared bankruptcy 6 months later. Last I heard, he was working for someone else's real estate company, making a fraction of what he used to earn. His reputation in our old city was permanently destroyed, so he'd had to move somewhere nobody knew his story. Sarah and David divorced after less than a year of marriage. According to family reports, David could never get past his doubts about her character. Sarah moved back home with our parents, her perfect life in ruins, her confidence shattered. It's been 2 years now since that awful wedding day. 2 years since I sat in that front row and watched my husband punish me for existing while he couldn't have someone else. 2 years since I discovered what I was really capable of when pushed beyond my limits. People ask me sometimes if I regret it. If I regret destroying my marriage, my sister's marriage, Marcus's entire life. If I think I went too far in my quest for revenge. And honestly, I sleep better now than I have in years. Marcus spent 7 years slowly erasing me from my own life. He made me feel worthless, invisible, inadequate. He used our marriage as a weapon against me, as evidence of his own settling, as a sob story to manipulate other women. He brought me to Sarah's wedding specifically to watch me suffer. He orchestrated that entire humiliation for his own entertainment, thinking I was too broken down to fight back. What he learned that day was that quiet doesn't mean weak. That submission doesn't mean stupid. That 7 years of being underestimated had given me plenty of time to learn exactly how his world worked and how easily it could fall apart. He married his dream woman in front of me. But I walked away with the truth. And the truth ruined them both. Subscribe if you believe that sometimes the quiet ones are the most dangerous. Comment your location so I know where my fellow survivors are watching from. And remember, underestimating someone's strength because they've chosen to endure your cruelty is the most dangerous mistake you can make. Because we're always watching, always learning, always waiting for the right moment to show you exactly who you've been dealing with all along.